The neon sign outside flickered as the cold wind howled through the nearly empty street. Inside Sam's liquor store, Darnell Hayes leaned against the counter, watching the clock tick toward closing time. It had been a slow night, just a handful of customers grabbing last-minute drinks before heading home. He didn't mind the quiet. In fact, he preferred it. Darnell wasn't just any cashier. At first glance, he looked like an ordinary guy. Broad shoulders, a clean-shaven face, and eyes that had seen too much. But beneath the surface, he was a former Marine, a four-tour Iraq veteran who had faced worse dangers than drunk customers and petty thieves. He had returned home years ago, trying to leave the battlefield behind, but the discipline, awareness, and instincts never left him. The bell above the door jingled, and Darnell glanced up. A man walked in wearing a dark hoodie with the hood pulled low over his face. Something about the way he moved set off alarms in Darnell's mind. He had learned to read people in the military, and this guy had trouble written all over him. "Evening," Darnell said casually, watching as the man browsed the shelves. The man didn't respond. Instead, he kept his head down, glancing toward the counter every few seconds. Darnell's grip tightened around the counter edge. His instincts screamed at him. Something was coming. Darnell slowly reached under the counter where a silent alarm button was installed, just in case. He had been in the store long enough to know that some nights weren't as quiet as they seemed, and tonight, trouble had just walked through the door. Darnell kept his expression neutral, but every muscle in his body tensed. He had seen this type of behavior before: hesitation, nervous glances, and the kind of false confidence that only came when someone was about to make a bad decision. The man moved toward the refrigerated section, opening the door and grabbing a cheap bottle of vodka. His fingers fumbled slightly as he shut the glass door. That was another warning sign. Nervous hands, unsteady movements. Darnell stayed calm. "That all for you tonight?" he asked as the man walked toward the counter. The guy didn't answer. Instead, he placed the bottle down and kept his hand stuffed inside his hoodie pocket. That was the moment Darnell knew for sure. This wasn't just another late-night customer. He glanced toward the small security camera in the corner. It was recording everything. That wouldn't stop what was about to happen, but it was something. The man took a slow breath, then finally spoke. "Open the register." Darnell's eyes locked onto him. He wasn't shouting, but his tone was sharp, demanding. And then it happened. The man pulled a gun from his hoodie, pointing it straight at Darnell. "Now!" he barked. "Hurry up!" Darnell didn't flinch. He had faced real danger before. This guy wasn't the first to aim a weapon at him. He had seen worse in war zones where real killers didn't hesitate. But this guy's hands were shaking. He was scared, desperate. That meant one of two things. Either he wasn't ready to pull the trigger, or he was nervous enough to do something reckless. Darnell kept his voice steady. "Son, you don't want to do this." But the man's eyes burned with desperation. His finger twitched on the trigger. Darnell knew. Things were about to escalate. Darnell remained perfectly still, his years of military training kicking in. He knew that sudden movements could set off a panicked gunman. His eyes stayed locked on the man's, reading him like a battlefield opponent. "Listen," Darnell said, his voice low and firm. "You don't want to do this. You're making a mistake." The gunman's grip tightened. "I don't have a choice," he snapped, his voice cracking. "Just give me the money." Darnell exhaled slowly. He had been in firefights overseas, faced enemy ambushes, and seen men crack under pressure. The man in front of him wasn't a hardened criminal. He was desperate, scared, and unpredictable. That made him even more dangerous. "All right," Darnell said, moving deliberately. He reached toward the register, but his sharp eyes caught every detail. The way the man's gun hand trembled, the sweat forming on his brow, the slight twitch in his left eye. He was on edge, but he wasn't a killer. Darnell's instincts told him he could de-escalate this. But he also knew that if the man made one wrong move, he would have to act fast. "You ever been in a real fight?" Darnell asked casually as he punched a button on the register. The drawer popped open with a soft ding. The gunman flinched slightly at the sound. "What?" Darnell didn't take his eyes off him. "I'm asking if you've ever fought for your life before. Because I have." His voice remained calm, but there was an edge to it now, a quiet warning. The man's breathing was shallow. He didn't answer. Darnell saw it. the hesitation. And in that moment he knew he had just planted a seed of doubt in the gunman's mind. But was it enough to stop him from pulling the trigger? Darnell kept his eyes locked on the gunman, his military instincts sharpening every second. He could see it now. This guy wasn't a seasoned criminal. He was jittery, his hands shaky, his breath uneven. A man truly determined to kill wouldn't hesitate like this. But hesitation was dangerous. It meant the robber was unpredictable, acting out of fear rather than logic, and fearful men made mistakes. Darnell moved slowly, deliberately, pulling a few bills from the register. "Take the money and walk out of here," he said evenly. "No one gets hurt. You don't want this to go bad." The gunman's eyes darted around the store, his paranoia growing. The silence felt heavy, like a thick fog settling between them. "You think I won't do it?" he snapped, trying to sound threatening. Darnell didn't flinch. He leaned slightly forward, his voice dropping lower. "I know you don't want to," he said, "and I know you don't have to." For the first time, the gunman seemed unsure. His hands twitched, and the barrel of the gun wavered slightly. Darnell saw his opportunity. His military training had taught him how to handle pressure, how to read people, how to take control of a situation, and right now, he was the one in control. "You ever hear of a four-tour Iraq vet?" Darnell asked, his voice steady. The gunman's brows furrowed in confusion. "What?" Darnell took a slow step forward. "Because that's me," he said, his tone calm but firm. "4 tours. I've been in real fights, and trust me, you don't want to test what I know." The gunman's breath hitched, his fingers twitched on the trigger, but now, for the first time, there was fear in his eyes. The shift in power had begun. The gunman stiffened, his grip tightening on the weapon. Darnell could see the inner turmoil playing out across his face. This wasn't a hardened killer. It was a desperate man acting on impulse, unsure of his next move. Darnell had faced worse. In war zones, he had encountered men just like this, scared, reckless, unpredictable. The trick wasn't to overpower them with brute force, but to make them realize they were already at a disadvantage. "You ever been in combat?" Darnell asked, his voice steady, measured. The gunman scoffed, but there was no real confidence behind it. "Man, I don't need combat to handle you." Darnell let out a slow breath. "That's where you're wrong." He lifted his hands slightly, keeping his movements controlled. "You think holding a gun makes you powerful, but real power, that comes from knowing how to use it." A flicker of doubt crossed the gunman's eyes. He shifted his weight, his stance uneven. Darnell noticed. A rookie mistake. The robber had probably never been in a real fight, let alone face someone trained for survival. Darnell took a calculated risk. His gaze dropped to the gun. "Safety's still on," he muttered. The gunman's expression shifted, confused, then panicked. He pulled the gun back slightly, his fingers fumbling over the side of the weapon, checking for the safety. That half-second was all Darnell needed. In a blur of movement, Darnell lunged forward, grabbing the gunman's wrist. He twisted it sharply, forcing the weapon upward. The robber yelped, caught off guard by the sudden, controlled aggression. The gun fired, a deafening blast that shattered a bottle on the shelf. The store filled with the smell of gunpowder and spilled alcohol. The fight had officially begun. The gunshot echoed through the store, glass shattering as liquor spilled across the floor. Darnell had acted on pure instinct, the muscle memory of his military training kicking in before he even had time to think. The robber staggered back, momentarily stunned by the recoil of his own weapon. Darnell capitalized on the distraction, using his grip on the man's wrist to wrench the gun further away from his body. The mugger growled in frustration, trying to regain control, but he was outmatched. Darnell had faced enemies who were deadlier, faster, and far more prepared than this. He had wrestled weapons from insurgents in the middle of gunfire. A liquor store robbery was nothing compared to that. The robber twisted his body, attempting to break free, but Darnell anticipated the move. He stepped forward, forcing the man off balance. In one swift motion, he slammed the robber's hand against the edge of the counter. A pained yelp escaped the thief's lips as his fingers involuntarily opened, the gun clattering to the floor. Darnell didn't hesitate. He kicked the weapon away, sending it skidding across the store. But the fight wasn't over yet. The robber, now realizing he had lost his biggest advantage, reacted with pure desperation. With a furious snarl, he swung wildly at Darnell's face. Darnell dodged with ease. The punch was sloppy, fueled by panic rather than technique. The veteran sidestepped and countered with a sharp elbow to the man's ribs. The air whooshed out of the robber's lungs as he doubled over in pain. Darnell didn't let up. He grabbed the man's hoodie, yanked him forward, and slammed him against the counter. The fight could have ended there, but Darnell knew better. Desperate men didn't give up so easily. And sure enough, the robber wasn't done yet. The robber groaned, slumping against the counter, but his eyes still burned with defiance. He wasn't going to go down without a fight. Darnell knew that look all too well. It was the gaze of a man backed into a corner, ready to do anything to escape. Before Darnell could react, the robber lunged, grabbing a bottle from the shelf and swinging it toward Darnell's head. Crash! Glass shattered as Darnell barely managed to dodge, the shards cutting into his arm. Pain flared up, but he ignored it. The adrenaline pumping through his veins dulled the sensation. The robber tried again, snatching another bottle, but this time, Darnell was ready. He caught the man's wrist mid-swing, twisted it sharply, and forced him to drop the weapon. The robber howled in pain, but Darnell wasn't done. With a swift motion, he hooked his leg behind the man's and swept him off his feet. The robber crashed onto the floor with a heavy thud, groaning as he tried to scramble away. Darnell pressed his boot against the man's chest, pinning him down. "Stay down," Darnell ordered, his voice low and firm. But the man wasn't listening. He flailed wildly, trying to buck Darnell off. His hands clawed at the ground, searching for anything to use as a weapon. Darnell knew he had to end this now. With practiced efficiency, he reached into his pocket and pulled out the zip ties he kept for security purposes. He grabbed the robber's arms and forced them behind his back, securing his wrists before the man could resist. The fight was over. The robber thrashed for a few moments before finally going limp, his chest heaving with exhaustion. Darnell exhaled, his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. He looked down at the man and shook his head. "You picked the wrong store," he muttered. Just then, the sound of approaching sirens filled the air. The distant wail of sirens grew louder, signaling the arrival of law enforcement. Darnell kept his boot pressed against the robber's chest, ensuring he stayed put. "Man, you really don't know how bad you messed up," Darnell muttered, shaking his head. The robber groaned but didn't respond. His chest rose and fell rapidly as he tried to catch his breath. The fight had drained the fight out of him, and he knew there was no escape now. Within seconds, red and blue lights flashed through the store's windows. The screech of tires outside signaled that multiple police cruisers had arrived. A moment later, the front door burst open. "Police! Hands where we can see them." Darnell calmly raised his hands and stepped back from the robber, who remained on the floor, wrists bound. Two officers rushed in, guns drawn, assessing the situation. Their eyes darted between Darnell and the subdued suspect. "Security footage will confirm everything," Darnell said, motioning toward the store's cameras. "This guy came in, pulled a gun on me, and tried to rob the place. I had to defend myself." One of the officers, a tall man with a no-nonsense expression, holstered his weapon and nodded. "We've had reports of a string of liquor store robberies in the area. Matches the description of our guy." The other officer bent down, checking the suspect's zip-tied wrists before looking up at Darnell with a raised brow. "You did this yourself?" Darnell smirked. "4 tours in Iraq. This ain't my first rodeo." The officer let out a low whistle. "Well, damn." A few minutes later, the officers hauled the robber to his feet, reading him his rights. As they escorted him toward the exit, he turned his head toward Darnell, eyes filled with resentment. "This ain't over," he muttered under his breath. Darnell chuckled, shaking his head. "Oh, trust me, it is." As the police led the robber outside, Darnell exhaled, finally allowing himself to relax. But something told him this night wasn't over just yet. As the police secured the scene, one of the officers, Detective Rachel Monroe, approached Darnell with a skeptical look. "You handled yourself well back there," she said, pulling out a notepad. "But I have to ask, how did you manage to take him down without a scratch on you?" Darnell folded his arms, his expression calm. "Like I said, 4 tours in Iraq. You learn a thing or two about combat." Detective Monroe exchanged a glance with her partner, Officer Daniels. "Still, most civilians panic in situations like this. You seemed," Darnell sighed. Look, I get it. You're wondering if I went too far, right? Monroe didn't answer right away. Instead, she flipped through her notepad, jotting down notes. We have to follow protocol, she finally said, even when the bad guy is the one lying on the floor. Darnell smirked. You're free to check the security footage. I didn't throw a single punch I didn't have to. Monroe nodded. We will. Then she gestured toward the counter. The owner, Mr. Patel, right, will need to confirm your employment. We need to be sure you weren't just some vigilante taking matters into your own hands. Darnell exhaled sharply. He knew this was coming. The police weren't just going to pat him on the back and walk away. He was a black man who had taken down an armed robber. Somehow, that always meant more questions. Just then, Mr. Patel rushed back into the store, breathless. Darnell, are you okay? I came as soon as I heard. Darnell turned to face his boss, relieved to see him. I'm fine, Mr. Patel. Just another day on the job. Monroe stepped forward. Mr. Patel, can you confirm that Darnell works here? Patel straightened his posture, nodding firmly. Of course. He's been with me for over 2 years. He's the best employee I have. Monroe studied Patel for a moment before closing her notepad. All right, we'll review the footage, but it looks like you handled yourself well, Mr. Carter. Darnell nodded but didn't relax. He had a feeling this wasn't over yet. Detective Monroe and Officer Daniels stepped into the back room where the liquor store's security cameras stored their footage. Darnell, Mr. Patel, and a few other officers followed. Monroe sat at the desk, rewinding the footage to the moment the robber entered. The screen flickered, showing the masked man pulling the gun and demanding money. There, Daniels muttered, pointing at the screen. That's when it started. They watched as Darnell raised his hands, appearing compliant. But then, as soon as the gunman was distracted, Darnell's precise movements unfolded in real time. Within seconds, he had the robber disarmed, pinned, and incapacitated. Monroe leaned closer, watching the replay carefully. That was clean, she admitted. No excessive force, just pure skill. Darnell smirked slightly. Told you. Mr. Patel exhaled in relief. See, he was just defending himself in my store. Daniels nodded. I've seen military guys handle situations before, but this was textbook. He turned to Darnell. Where'd you learn moves like that? Darnell crossed his arms. Marine Corps, Iraq, 4 tours. Monroe turned off the screen and faced Darnell. All right, everything checks out, but there's still something bothering me. Darnell arched a brow. And what's that? Monroe glanced at the unconscious robber, now being loaded onto a stretcher by paramedics. Why this store? This wasn't a random robbery. Something tells me he knew what he was doing. Darnell frowned. You think someone sent him? Monroe shrugged. We won't know until we question him. But if there's more to this, I hope you're ready. Darnell clenched his jaw. He had handled war zones before, but this fight might not be over yet. Detective Monroe and Officer Daniels stood outside the liquor store, watching as the paramedics loaded the unconscious robber into the ambulance. Darnell and Mr. Patel remained inside, their minds still processing what had just happened. This wasn't random, Monroe muttered, crossing her arms. Daniels frowned. You really think someone sent him? Monroe nodded. Think about it. This guy walked in, went straight for the register, and didn't seem worried about cameras. Either he was incredibly reckless or he was acting on someone else's orders. Daniels exhaled sharply. And if he was, then we have bigger problems. Monroe glanced back at Darnell through the store window. I need to ask him some more questions. Inside, Darnell was helping Mr. Patel organize the shelves that had been knocked over during the scuffle. When Monroe entered, Darnell looked up. What now? He asked, sensing she wasn't done with him yet. Monroe got straight to the point. Do you have enemies, Darnell? He scoffed. Lady, I served in Iraq. I've had more enemies than I can count. But stateside? No. I mind my business. Monroe studied him carefully. What about people from your past? Old grudges? Darnell shook his head. I left all that behind when I came home. I just work here to get by. Mr. Patel stepped forward. Detective, are you saying this man was here for Darnell, not just the money? Monroe didn't answer right away. Instead, she pulled out a small notebook and flipped through her notes. I'll need to run a background check on the suspect, she finally said. Something tells me this was more than just a robbery. Darnell's jaw tightened. He didn't like where this was going. If someone had sent that man specifically for him, it meant his past wasn't as buried as he thought. Darnell couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. He sat behind the counter, his fingers drumming against the wood as Monroe made her calls outside. Mr. Patel kept stealing worried glances at him. "You think someone from your military days might have sent that guy?" Mr. Patel finally asked. Darnell exhaled sharply. "Doubt it. Most of the guys I served with are either dead or trying to survive like me. But what if it's someone you don't remember?" Darnell rubbed his temples. "That's what's bothering me." Before Mr. Patel could respond, the bell over the door jingled. Both men turned as a stranger stepped inside. He was a tall man in a dark hoodie, hands tucked into his pockets, eyes scanning the store. Darnell's instincts kicked in immediately. Something felt off. "Evening," the man said, his voice low and steady. "Can I help you?" Darnell asked, straightening up. The man smirked. "Nah, just looking around." Mr. Patel watched him carefully, but it was Darnell who took a slow step forward. The stranger's eyes flicked to him. "You work here?" Darnell nodded. "Yeah." The man chuckled under his breath. "Huh, guess the rumors were true." Darnell's stomach tightened. "What rumors?" Before the man could answer, Monroe walked back inside. The moment she saw him, her expression hardened. "Jamal Green," she said. "Didn't think I'd be seeing you around here." Jamal grinned. "Relax, detective. I'm just here to shop." Monroe didn't buy it. She took a step closer. "What do you know about the guy who tried to rob this place tonight?" Jamal smirked. "I know he was just the first." Darnell's blood ran cold. This wasn't over. Darnell's grip tightened around the counter as he locked eyes with Jamal. The way the man stood, his posture too casual, too confident, sent alarms through his gut. Monroe didn't flinch. "First, huh? You saying there's more coming?" Jamal's smirk never faded. "I'm saying this ain't random. You stirred something up, old man." He glanced at Darnell, his tone almost amused. "Someone's real interested in what you've been up to." Darnell's jaw clenched. "I've been working. That's it." Jamal chuckled, shaking his head. "Yeah? You think the past stays buried just 'cause you want it to? Somebody out there remembers you, and they don't like what they remember." Monroe stepped forward, her hand hovering near her hip where her off-duty weapon was holstered. "Who?" she demanded. Jamal sighed dramatically. "Now, why would I just give up names? I'm not in the business of snitching." He leaned on the counter, his dark eyes gleaming. "But I'll say this, you got about 24 hours before things get real messy." Mr. Patel's face paled. "What do you mean?" Jamal straightened. "I mean, you should think about closing up shop for a while. Ain't safe for y'all no more." Darnell stepped around the counter, his eyes never leaving Jamal's. "I don't scare easy." Jamal studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Yeah, that's what they said about you." With that, he turned and walked out, the bell jingling softly behind him. Silence hung in the store. Monroe muttered a curse. "We need to find out who sent him." Darnell's gaze lingered on the door. He wasn't sure what haunted him more, Jamal's words or the memories they were starting to awaken. The tension in the liquor store hung heavy after Jamal's warning. Monroe's fingers drummed anxiously against the counter, while Darnell remained silent, his gaze fixed on the door, as if expecting another threat to walk through at any moment. Mr. Patel was the first to break the silence. "Darnell, what did he mean? Who remembers you?" Darnell exhaled slowly. "I don't know," he lied. Monroe shot him a sharp look. "Cut the crap, Carter. That guy wasn't just throwing around words. He knew something about you." Darnell clenched his jaw. His past had been locked away for years, but it seemed like someone had dug it back up. He knew that voice, that smirk. It all reminded him of something from long ago. "He called me first," Darnell finally muttered. Monroe nodded. "Yeah, and that means there's more coming. You need to talk." Darnell crossed his arms. "Back in Iraq, my unit ran operations that weren't exactly standard. We made enemies, dangerous ones. There were people we dealt with, groups we shut down. Some of them weren't just overseas." Mr. Patel swallowed hard. "Are you saying?" Darnell nodded. "If someone's digging into my past, that means they've been waiting for the right time. They want payback." Monroe's expression darkened. "We need to get ahead of this. If this is revenge, they won't stop at warnings." Darnell's hand instinctively went to his hip, where his holstered weapon rested. "Let them come." Monroe wasn't convinced. "No, we're not waiting. We find them first." Darnell met her eyes, a cold determination settling in. Then we start tonight. Night had settled over the liquor store, but Darnell wasn't waiting for trouble to find him. He, Monroe, and Mr. Patel gathered in the back room, reviewing the security footage from earlier that day. The grainy video showed Jamal's retreat, but something else caught Darnell's eye. An unfamiliar car parked across the street, its engine running even after Jamal had left. There, Darnell pointed at the screen. They're watching. Monroe grabbed her phone. I'll call this in. Darnell shook his head. No cops. If this is about my past, it won't end with an arrest. They'll come back. As if on cue, the store's front door rattled. Monroe and Darnell exchanged glances. Mr. Patel ducked behind the counter, fear evident in his eyes. Darnell moved swiftly, positioning himself near the entrance, his hand resting on his holstered weapon. Monroe pulled out her own firearm, steady and ready. The door creaked open, and two men stepped inside, both unfamiliar, both armed. One of them smirked. Darnell Carter. Been a long time. Darnell remained still. Not long enough. You took something from us back in Iraq. We're here to collect. Darnell's grip tightened. Not in my store. Before they could raise their weapons, Monroe and Darnell moved. In a matter of seconds, it was over. One man disarmed, the other writhing on the floor, his gun kicked away. Sirens wailed in the distance. Mr. Patel had called the cops. Darnell stood over the intruders, his heart pounding. This was only the beginning, but one thing was clear. He wasn't running anymore. Monroe smirked. Guess they didn't know who they were messing with. Darnell exhaled. They do now. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and comment. What would you have done in Darnell's situation? Let us know your thoughts. For more thrilling stories like this, follow us and stay tuned for the next one.